Well, delighted to be here with Gemma today, one of our Paralympic wheelchair fencers. It's got a lot of accolades to her name, 20 World Cups, and she's the first British woman to win a wheelchair fencing World Cup in 2018. And she was world number one in the women's épée category A back in 2023. So welcome, Gemma. I suppose a great place to start would be you've had an absolutely great career, and it would be great to hear a little bit about how you got there and your journey in sport.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks so much for everyone for joining for starters. Yeah, so in terms of how I got into it, I was always really, really sporty growing up. It was the thing that I loved most. Kind of, I guess, the thing that just made me feel like me. And when I was growing up, that was hockey, athletics, figure skating for a while, but athletics was the main thing. And I wanted my huge dream as a kid was to go to an Olympic Games in triple jump. And I was doing really well in that as I was kind of going through my teenage years, until one day when I was competing, I got this sharp pain in my ankle. And I knew it wasn't good, but it was ever important to get every single extra centimetre for my school, carried on. And then the next day I went and saw the doctor, and I could barely walk by this point. And initially they said, don't worry about it, you'll be fine in a couple of weeks, you've just sprained your ankle. But kind of weeks went past, then months, then half a year, then a year, and things were no better, and nobody could really tell me what happened and why I was in so much pain. And the pain was just getting worse and worse. And eventually, probably about 18 months, maybe 2 years after that initial injury, I got diagnosed with complex regional pain syndrome, which basically means that the nerves in my right leg weren't functioning properly anymore. The only signals they'd be sending really were for pain. So if you can imagine, kind of on a pain scale, kind of, one, from 0 to 10, and 10 being the worst pain you can imagine, I was kind of like 8 out of 10 on a really good day and 10 out of 10 on the worst. And that was a condition as well that was progressive and was kind of affecting me more and more. And I remember the doctor saying to me, you're not going to run again, you're not going to walk again, you're not going to do sport again. And that was the most crushing part for me at that stage, because sport was the thing I loved, and I felt like I'd lost my identity and who I was a little bit. But I was really, really fortunate. I kind of moped around for a couple of years thinking, oh, I wish my life would go back to how it used to be. I wish I could still do all these things. And it wasn't until I got into sports volunteering and then kind of stumbled upon disability sport and realised that I was eligible for it at the time under the classification code as it was then, that I really started to think, okay, well, what could I do with the rest of my body? Started out in wheelchair basketball and then eventually landed in fencing, really by chance. I went to university in Durham, and this old man came up to me when I was training for basketball and said, hi, my name's Laszlo. I'm the GB head coach for wheelchair fencing. Would you like to try it? And I very nearly said no, because the only thing I knew about wheelchair fencing in comparison to basketball is that the chairs were fixed into a frame. And I thought, well, I love crashing into people at top speed in my basketball chair. Why on earth would I want to move to a sport where we're fixed into that frame? It's going to be so boring. It's going to be like chess. And I so nearly said no. But I think after a few years of having this situation where I couldn't do anything, I'd kind of changed my attitude a little bit and was like, well, actually, just say yes to opportunities and try things, and then you'll find out. So I went along and tried it. And I couldn't have been more wrong, because it's so fast, because you can't run away. And the fact that it is a little bit like chess is the thing I love most about it. So that's kind of how I got into the sport. And that was about 10 months before the London Paralympic Games, where we also had host nation slots. And straight away hatched this kind of secret dream with Laszlo, my coach at the time, that we would try and aim to get into that women's team. And I very fortunately did. Went to my first games in London, which was the most incredible experience. You could feel the ground shaking, you got hit with all the home crowd there. And then when I got back, Laszlo said to me, okay, now you actually have to learn how to fence, because at the moment you're basically just fighting off instinct. And I think that's really when probably the real fencing journey began, because then it was, okay, how do I actually do this sport? What does it take? What does it take lifestyle wise? What does it take tactically, technically? Where have I got to improve? Because for the next games, I'm going to have to qualify individually, and that's going to be a really, really hard task. And very, very fortunate that since then I've been to another 3 games, so 4 in total now, and obviously aiming for LA at the minute.
Well, that's a really impressive journey. What would be your highlight? Obviously, you've qualifying for the games is probably a great achievement, but within that whole journey, what's been your greatest achievement? in the whole process?
Oh, that's a really tricky one. I think it's hard to pick between two. So I think my first World Cup win was massive for me because, the boys had already been, Piers and Dimitri had obviously been smashing it and been doing amazingly. But I hadn't quite got to the top of that podium, and I'd got a couple of bronzes, but I hadn't quite got to the top of that podium yet. And doing that and becoming the first British woman to do that on at a World Cup level was really, really special. And I beat kind of like my main hero when I came into the sport to do that. So I think that was like probably the first big moment. But I think probably the greatest achievement is probably, I would have said, so you mentioned there obviously that I became world number one a couple of years ago for a very brief time. And I would have said that because that was a huge World Cup win to get that. And it was against one of my Chinese opponents who there's only like two of us outside of the Chinese athletes that have beaten her. And that was absolutely incredible. It felt like an out of body experience. I remember going onto the piece and just thinking, you're on the live stream. So we really don't want to get like 15 1'd. Like we don't want that for my ego. And that was my main like goal going into that fight. And I thought like just don't get battered. Just don't get battered on the live stream in front of everybody. And I kind of went into it and I was like, I'm just gonna give it everything. I'm gonna be so aggressive and just see how she responds. And I remember I was like 8-0 up in about 30 seconds, and I was like, what is happening to me? And it felt like a completely out of body experience. So that was obviously a really huge moment. But even so, probably the biggest was just getting silver at the Europeans, because I feel like I'd had this narrative in my own head that whenever I go to the big major championships, I underperform and it just doesn't happen for me. And I kind of panic and I let everything, the scenario, the fact that I want it so much more at a major championships, whether that's a Euros, a Worlds, or a Games, I let that affect me and I just kind of freeze and I'm not able to fence the way I'm able to. And I think that European Championships was the first time that I really managed to just enjoy myself on the piste at a major championships. And I made a slight mistake right at the end, 14-12 up in the final, ended up losing 15-14. But actually, just that whole day, and I remember the main thing for me was just figuring out that the balance for me, where I need to be mentally when I'm fencing, is I need to have gratitude for what I'm doing. Because if I think back to the situation I've been in throughout my life, thinking I was never going to do sport again, and I'd had all these dreams growing up, and I am living those. Like I've gone to the Paralympic Games a number of times. I'm representing my country, all the things I wanted to do. So now I try and balance like that gratitude of thinking when I'm sat in the call room and I'm really nervous, I'm thinking, oh, like how would like 8-year-old Gemma feel about being in this situation? It's just the best thing ever, and I'm so lucky to be here. And balancing that with also going, I do still want to win it though, and it's just that fine balance so that I've got that gratitude and that enjoyment, but still that ambition. And I think that probably is the biggest achievement, was actually just working out that's where I need to be when I'm fencing, and that's led to a lot more consistency.
Yeah, no, I can totally understand. Like you mentioned before about the doctor saying that you'd never even do sport again. So how do you how do you even comprehend where you've got to today and what's that kind of feeling of one day being told you won't ever do sport, never mind go to a Paralympic Games, to now have gone to all the Paralympic Games that you can possibly go to since your career started?
Yeah, I think it is just one of like immense privilege. I think I'm so honoured to be in a situation in the position that I'm in and doing what I'm doing and doing something I love every single day. Like I still wake up for training every day and I feel a bit like a kid at Christmas. There's maybe like one session per 6 months where I think, oh, I'm a bit tired, I could stay in bed. But for the most part, I'm like a kid at Christmas and I just love it. And I think that's probably why kind of, people say like, oh, like, do you think you'll stop after the next games or whatever? I'm kind of like, I just can't imagine stopping because I love it and I really enjoy what I do. And I think it's just kind of having that appreciation, because sometimes the training obviously is hard, sometimes the results go wrong, but it's not life or death. Like, yes, but into perspective, the world's going to keep turning whether you win or you lose at a competition. But actually, what you're doing is such a huge honor and something you should really enjoy whilst you've got the opportunity, because there are a million people that would like to be doing it.
No, yeah. And coming from a background as well of able-bodied sport, how have you found that intersection of being a female and an athlete as well? How is that even across both able-bodied and like parasport? How have you found that?
Sorry, you just cut out a little bit there.
Oh, sorry, I'll repeat that. So you've come from a background of able-bodied sport as well as para sport. How have you found the intersection of being a female and an athlete? What's kind of the experience you've seen as you've come through both sports?
Yeah, I think as a female athlete, it's definitely things are improving in terms of kind of I think probably the respect level that you get and also the interest in women's sport and things like that, and people really appreciating kind of I guess what we do as women within sport. So I think that's come a long way, and I think even since when I started to now. But I think it's still one of those where at times you still feel like you're almost trying to prove yourself a little bit more, and you almost have to show that actually what we're doing is just as impressive. It obviously maybe I'm moving slightly less quickly, maybe I can't lunge quite as far, but actually what we're doing and the reason that we are obviously in those separate categories is because of those kind of physical differences, but they should be appreciated equally and celebrated equally. And I think that's something that I'm always really trying to push. I'm on the gender equity kind of commission for the International Wheelchair Fencing Federation, and really just trying to make sure that actually we're really valuing both men's and women's wheelchair fencing kind of equally, and making sure that when we're programming the schedule, it's not always we'll finish with the men's showpiece final. So I think sometimes yeah, you still feel little bit like you're trying to kind of put your hand up and go like, yeah, we're doing our thing too. But I think it definitely has improved a lot, and I think you can kind of see that in the way the events are put together.
Yeah, and when you're training as well, obviously being a female athlete, we obviously have a menstrual cycle, which is totally different to a male athlete. How have you found integrating and managing your menstrual cycle through competitions, training, travel, kind of even any hints and tips for any girls out there? What would you say about your experience and going forward? What have you found works best?
Yeah, so I think it's such an individual thing, and everybody will kind of have a very different experience with it. I think for me, it's been really important actually kind of getting an app and tracking my cycle so that I can work out where I am, because over time I've then been able to identify, well, for me, kind of actually there's a couple of days just before my period starts where I'm a little bit more susceptible or vulnerable to injury, and then actually maybe how do I balance my training around that time? Or also, if I do feel a little bit of a tweak that normally I'd be like, oh, this is okay to push through or kind of train through it, it's not too bad. Actually, that little bit of soreness might be almost my first warning sign that kind of next session maybe something not so great could happen. So I think that's been part of it, is just really learning how to track that so that I can work out for myself, how does my cycle affect me. But I think the biggest thing is actually just being able to talk to your team about it. So I'm really, really lucky that I've always had personal coaches who have been really open to those discussions, and they've not kind of shied away from it. And I think there still sometimes is an element of that, and I think it's so important as a female athlete sometimes to take it upon yourselves to really approach your coach and say, look, this is actually something that's really important. There's a great book out there. I can't remember what it's called right now, but it's all about kind of female athletes and the menstrual cycle. And actually, even just saying to your coach, look, can you read this book? And like, because if you kind of understand it, I kind of understand it, then we can work together on it. And we need to be able to have open conversations. So being able to say to John when I start a lesson, like I'm on my period at the minute and I'm feeling X, Y, Z, and we can then tailor the lesson around that. So I think that's one of the most important things, is really then taking it upon yourself to advocate for why it's important that you can have those open discussions, and trying to as well, like on a wider level, really break kind of any stigma or taboo around it. There's been some really great kind of efforts, I think, by the Well HQ, who are always worth having a look at, and things like that, who really do a lot to campaign for why it's important for women to understand how their cycle affects them within sport. So I think the more we can educate ourselves, then the more you can advocate for yourself and why it's important to talk about, the better.
No, I totally agree. I think validating as well how we as women feel when we're on our period, and um, being like intuitive to what our bodies are telling us is still something that's not widely talked about in the sports community, especially at club level as well as coming up to elite level. So that's really good tips of just getting confidence in being able to speak about it, and sharing how you're feeling with coaches
Yeah.
is some way of moving forward. I would 100% agree.
I think as well with that,
With
sorry, I just say the other thing this is really important to say is sometimes there's this myth in sport amongst female athletes that like, oh, if you lose your period, that's normal because you're a high performing athlete and you're training really hard and that's really normal. And I think it's so important that people realize that that's not the case. If for any reason you miss your period or your cycle is completely different to usual, actually that's something to address, and that's something that I've gone through the last 18 months. And for me, it wasn't that I lost my period, it was actually that my period essentially ended up coming like every 10 days. And then I was getting injuries a lot
right,
around it. And I thought because I hadn't lost it, it wasn't a problem. And I just kind of put up with it. And I put up with a load of other symptoms around it that I didn't really connect all the dots together. And it's only been actually since Paris in the last few months that we've basically identified eventually that basically I just wasn't fueling well enough for the training I was doing. I was kind of overtraining, under fueling. But because I have a progesterone implant in my arm, which basically I felt was the best way to manage my periods and particularly kind of actually for me keep myself on like an emotional even keel throughout my cycles. That's kind of one thing that I identified is that the implant works really well for me. Because I had that, instead of losing my periods when I was under fueling, my periods just went crazy. And that's another thing is like just understanding that any major change in your cycle actually could be kind of like your first warning sign that maybe you're not fueling adequately or there's something kind of not quite right with your hormonal balance as a result of the training you're doing. And just talk to somebody about it and get that help.
yeah. Well, you could enhance your performance by doing so. It could be something about of your recovery that is really the
Yeah.
reason why your body's trying to tell you something at the end of the day. So listen to it. I think that's a great message out there for girls out there not to be feel like they've got to ignore any of these symptoms and actually act on it, have confidence. It's totally natural and we all go through it and you can actually be a better athlete by listening to it. I think that's a great message that you've kind of portrayed there. In terms of the next generation of female athletes, what would be your biggest piece of advice for them in sport?
I think it would be probably like don't settle for kind of I think the status quo. Don't settle for potentially at times from some people, from a lot of people not, but from some people, secondary treatment or being treated like an afterthought, or maybe the training being geared towards the men in your team or the men in your club rather than yourselves. Or maybe there's a mixed competition and actually you really feel like you'd benefit as a women's group in your club from having a women's competition as well. And things like that. It's just make sure that you feel like you're getting the kind of same level of I guess opportunity in every area and also the same level of respect. And I think basically just not settling for anything less than that. And sometimes that means you feel like a bit of a pain in the bum. I've definitely over my career a few times felt like, oh, people probably just think I'm a nightmare because I'm mentioning this. But actually, if you don't mention it, then it just stays the same. And also sometimes you mention something and then loads of people around you go, oh yeah, I thought that as well, or I wasn't happy about that as well. And you realize that, oh, if you'd all just spoken about the fact that you weren't super happy with the way something was going or the way you were being treated, then you maybe could have kind of changed it a lot earlier. I think I'd say the same with, I think in general, the more you put up with certain situations, the more you almost set that as a like standard for what's acceptable. Whereas every time you speak up and you say, actually, that's not quite good enough, then you're pushing that standard up and hopefully kind of improving the situation for not just yourself, but the girls and the women and girls that are going to follow you.
Would you say that feeling of maybe not speaking out when you should is one of the biggest challenges as a female athlete in the sports community? Or is there
Um,
something else that more challenging?
I no, I definitely think that is one of them. I think because sometimes maybe you get dismissed or people make out like you're making a fuss or you get labeled as maybe like a troublemaker for actually just pushing for kind of equality. I think that can be a real barrier, and particularly in situations where maybe there's selection involved and things like that, you kind of almost feel a bit more reticent to have those conversations or to bring up those points because you think, well, maybe the percentage of men to women in my squad is heavily weighted towards 80, or in the club heavily weighted towards men, like say 80-20 or whatever it is, and you might think, well, it's going to be quite obvious that I've potentially been the one that's kicked up a fuss here, and then you're kind of feeling like you're maybe between a rock and a hard place. You want to say something, but you don't really feel able to or comfortable to. So I think it's really important, and really challenging to do that. But I think if you are able to do it, it's really important and really valuable. But yeah, I think that's one of them. I think beyond that, it's just actually the fact that so much sports science research is really still geared towards men, and the fact that we maybe still don't have as much understanding, whether that's to do with kind of like breast health and what sports bra you should be wearing, how often you should be buying a sports bra. Like, they shouldn't have a lifespan of more than 12 months. And who of us actually replaces our sports bras every 12 months? But actually, like, after 12 months, they're not giving you the support they once were. And it's all little things like that that we're only really starting to kind of understand now. And so some of it is just you almost are working out a little bit yourself along the way, still, because there's still not that background of information out there.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. If you were to think about increasing female representation at the elite level, how would you think would be the best way to do that?
Are we talking domestically?
I think if you think about, yeah, domestically into the elite
Yeah,
area, I think they obviously feed into each other. So if we were
yeah,
to start at, say, club level community kind of domestic scene,
yeah.
what do you think could be done now to help, I don't know, Brisbane Olympics have increased female representation in fencing?
Yeah. I think it's. I don't think it's a problem specifically towards, certainly within wheelchair fencing specifically. I don't think it's particularly a problem, particularly like on one gender side. I think we've got we're definitely bringing more people through, having more frames available, and more wheelchairs available in this country and things like that are definitely helping, as are the increased number of domestic events. But it's still that challenge of, because we're almost competing against all these other sports that maybe have a kind of like much more established pathway. You look at wheelchair basketball and para athletics and things like that, they're a lot easier to get into. And like para swimming, you just need swimming costume and goggles. So I think our
Mhm.
problem is actually probably more across the board. It's just, how do we compete with these sports when we're saying to people, actually it's really quite expensive, and you actually do need quite a bit of kit, and also, as it stands, kind of in terms of like funding pathway and things, you have to compete and perform and like get results at a much higher level in order to get that support. So I think that's probably actually across the board, men and women, our biggest problem in terms of getting people into the sport, because we're just competing against other sports that can essentially off the bat almost have a slightly more attractive offer in terms of like, here's how we can help you. So I think that's a challenge across both genders, but I think particularly on the women's side, we haven't, since I've been competing, we obviously had a women's team in London, and since then I've been the sole female at each Paralympic Games I've gone to, for GB, and it's obviously, I think we need to change that. We definitely need to change that. We really need to try and get kind of more women to the games, so that so that people coming through and people starting out in the sport can hopefully see a bit more of a pathway and how that is possible. I think at the moment it probably almost feels a little bit unachievable. I think it's a bit easier on the men's side at the moment because they've had the men's team and they've been really successful and they've brought more people through as part of that. I think it's a little bit easier for people on the men's side to see, oh, okay, that's how I can maybe make the step from here to go into the games or competing on the World Cup circuit, and then actually getting those results at a really high level. So I think, yeah, it's about how can we really develop that as a group, and I think we're definitely making progress there. We have competed in the women's team a few times. Hopefully, we're going to do some more. I'll be competing along with my teammates at the World Championships in a women's team event for the very first time in a couple of weeks' time, which is a great start. And also going into LA, because the team formats have changed and we have mixed team. Hopefully, that's naturally going to kind of hopefully bring the women's side a little bit more in line with the men's side in terms of development and the resources that gets put into it and things like that, because ultimately we're going to all be put together for that, and I think that could be a really good thing for developing women's fencing in this country.
Yeah, so having a more clear defined pathway for female sport, especially in fencing, para fencing, would probably be your number one idea
Yeah.
of, yeah, of increasing representation. I think that's, yeah, having it. I think a standardized approach that's been on the men's side is something that we could bring across onto the female side and really kickstart female representation. What do you feel about in terms of female representation, especially in a combat sport? Do you feel there is female athletes who are less inclined to take it to an elite level because it's a combat sport?
I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't say I've encountered a lot of people kind of having that as, I guess, as mentioning that as a barrier myself from kind of like conversations I've had with people. I do think that I think sometimes because of I think in general you have some issues in terms of dropout in women's sport because there tend to be kind of generalizing here. I think kind of statistically speaking, you're probably looking at a higher percentage of people who maybe have a kind of maybe more conscious of like the body image side of things. And then also the kit we wear is quite unpleasant. It gets really sweaty, it gets really horrible. And there's also this kind of, and you're wearing your mask, and it's just like, I think for some people, they just feel like, oh, that's not feminine. And I think actually our challenge is to really kind of like broaden that idea of what is kind of femininity and what does being a woman and being a woman in sport look like. And actually being strong, being able to use your body to the best of your ability, and being able to just be as good as you can at something are all incredible things and something we should be promoting as like ideals and values to young girls, not just young boys. I think that's more kind of a society issue is that we still, certainly through the media and social media and things like that, there's still this kind of portrayal that actually you're really valuable as a woman if you're one thing, and if it's usually around kind of like aesthetics and things like that. And then as a man, your values are something else, and it's usually more kind of like physical attributes and strength and things like that. And it's actually how can we try and challenge that and show that whether you're a man or a woman, like all of those things are things to be valued, and that's not to say that kind of those things are not valuable as well. But actually, how can we show people that you can be a really, really well-rounded person, whether you're male or female, and that we value and we celebrate all of you?
Absolutely. I think being a strong woman and how sport can make you a strong woman physically and mentally, we have to deal with quite a lot. We spoke about the menstrual cycle and using your menstrual cycle to your power, how your hormones affect your strength, how you're training. I think more education around that and what you've just spoke on, I would 100% agree. And I think it's great to hear about promoting more about the capabilities of women more than the aesthetics of what people think we should be like and fitting us into a box. So I 100% agree.
Yeah,
With
I think sometimes people do that without meaning to as well. I think like it might just be a comment. So like I've had comments before when I go to training, I'm not wearing makeup. My hair is maybe not been washed that morning because I'm about to sweat it all through anyway. And like I don't look my most aesthetically pleasing self, so we say. And and then like say I post a photo at the weekend on Instagram and I've got makeup on, I've done my hair, I'm wearing a nice dress or whatever it is. And like somebody might make a comment that's kind of it's a joke, but it's like, oh, you scrub up well. It's a shame you don't look like that every day here or something. And it's like I'm in different scenarios, and it's like really, really acceptable and normal to kind of like dress and put in an effort level on your appearance, kind of like dependent on what situation you're in. Like that's so normal. It's just like between whether you
yeah,
wear your pajamas or whether you put on a suit. It's no different to that. It's context dependent. But little comments like that
yeah.
sometimes actually, I think, really, particularly for younger girls and things like that, can be quite damaging because it makes out like, oh well, you know, you look great at the weekend, but you look a bit rough now. And actually, that kind of like that can impact you and how you value yourself as well.
Well, social media is becoming such a big part of young people's lives now. It's a lot more prevalent than it has ever been before. And generations like the next generation below us are they're younger and younger getting on Instagram and Facebook, and they see this, and that would potentially be a barrier to them getting involved if I don't want to have someone make those comments on me and I should look pretty and I should look feminine and scrub up well all the time. You constantly see people or girls with full face of makeup going to the gym, and it does make you think how much impact does that have of people's comments about what they should look like all the time.
Yeah, and the
Um,
thing is it should always be your
yes.
personal choice. Like I wear a full
Yeah,
face of makeup when I'm competing because I think look good, feel good, fence good, but also hopefully I'm going to medal at the end of the day. And my personal wish is for the photo I post afterwards for me to be looking exactly like that, and that's absolutely fine.
yeah,
And if you want to train in a full face of makeup, absolutely fine. But people shouldn't feel under pressure or feel like they're less feminine if they don't, or more feminine if they
yeah,
do, and that they somehow are
yes.
fitting this box better of what other people think they should be. And I also think in terms of social media and stuff like that. The other issue, and really lucky that in wheelchair fencing, I say lucky. It's not great from a sponsorship perspective, but from a social media trolling perspective, lucky that we're nowhere near famous. So we don't have to deal with people maybe commenting and sending like really horrible comments. But if you look at any of the women's footballers that have just won the Euros, you only have to look through their social media for like 2 minutes before you realize that people are saying, oh, they're making comments about their weight, about their appearance, and all these different things, as well as their ability as a footballer. And it's a lot, and you kind of see that, and then you probably internalize a little bit some of it. So yeah, so I think it's a really difficult problem to kind of tackle head on because it's a much wider societal thing.
Yeah, absolutely. We've spoke quite a bit there about the challenges of being a female in sport, and obviously you have to deal with a lot, um, as well as being an athlete. So how would you then say the experiences of facing the intersection of being a female and then being a disabled athlete as well? How does that play out, and what is it like?
Yeah, I think I think it's one of those where it obviously varies a lot day to day. Like a lot of the time, the experience is really positive. In terms of like I feel like particularly within kind of the British fencing community, like I feel like there is a pretty decent on the whole level of respect for kind of what we do in our discipline versus standing. So I think that's great, and it's always really nice to have that in a club setting people are more than happy to kind of come, sit down, like if anything, sometimes I'm like, I'm sorry guys, this is my last fight. So it's really, really nice that people are just so comfortable just hopping into a wheelchair and giving it a go or using it as part of their training and kind of maybe them reflecting, oh, that was really great for my blade work because I couldn't use my feet. I had to kind of fence in a different way and what benefit they got from it. So I think, a lot of the time it's really positive. I think there are still moments where it's not as positive in terms of, I think, like I said, on the whole, it's pretty good, but there's still definitely a section of kind of even kind of our community domestically who maybe don't have quite the same level of respect for wheelchair fencing as they do standing, or they feel like maybe it's a easier version of in terms of maybe we have because we have lower numbers competing in our events and therefore it must be easier to get a World Cup medal in a wheelchair than it is standing. And that's a kind of challenging one because it's really statistically it's just not really factually correct because there's only 15% of the population globally that have a disability. Not all of that 15% are classifiable. Not all of that 15% want to do sports. Those that do, not all of that 15% want to do wheelchair fencing specifically. And if you actually then kind of work out our entry numbers as like a percentage of say standing entry numbers, actually like we're smashing it. We definitely have much higher entries than 15%. So if anything, like as a proportion of like our like the potential kind of thing when you extrapolate, it's not that our events are easier because we have less people. Of course, we have less people. There are less people who are able to fence in a wheelchair. So I think that, but I do think that's still a challenge. Like sometimes people will say, "Oh, you've only got to win X amount of Ds and then you've got a medal." So there's definitely still a little bit of that, which is unfortunate and definitely something I think we'd like to change. And I think, ultimately in our events, once you get to, especially the last eight, once you get to the last eight, like every single person there is capable of winning the event. And, it's really, really tough. And to get to the Paralympics is insanely tough. You've basically got to be ranked top six in the world in order to qualify as an individual. And I think, yeah, so you've got a little bit of that. And then occasionally it's just, just little comments when people are maybe kind of haven't had much experience of disability. Maybe they haven't really encountered anyone with a disability before, and it's sometimes it's just the smallest comments that are probably meant as a joke, but actually kind of as somebody with a disability on the wrong day kind of get you a little bit. So I think there's a little bit of that, and I think once you combine kind of maybe the odd comment about kind of whether you've scrubbed up well or not, combined with another comment about your disability, sometimes on the wrong day, like you're just like, oh, I'm just going to go have a cry for a sec. But for that's the odd day. So yeah, there's definitely still progress to be made in both of those areas, I think. But I think on the whole, it's a pretty positive experience within kind of our domestic scene, and yeah, and certainly, I think one of the best things as a wheelchair fencer, and I think for any that I would always say to new wheelchair fencers coming in, is that when you do go to a World Cup event, it's such an incredible atmosphere because every single other person there gets it, and every single person there has such an extensive experience of, okay, their impairment may be different to yours, but they totally get what it's like living with that, because every day there is going to be something that you do differently because of your impairment, and it can be the smallest thing, but you just get that, oh, okay, you just make adaptations, and the world isn't quite 100% set up for you, but you make do and you do your best, and hopefully places have catered to you as best as they can. But yeah, that's what I always say to kind of new wheelchair fencers is, look, like it's such an incredible community to be a part of, because whether you make it to Paralympic Games or you just do the odd event or the odd satellite or you just do the domestic events, it's really nice. I think particularly if you've got a newly acquired disability like I did when I was younger, to just surround yourself by other people and learn from them, and okay, well, how do you deal with this situation? So I think there's a lot of positives to it as well.
Yeah, being really open-minded and actually accessing those support areas and knowing how to go forward as a disabled athlete as well. That's kind of what I gleaned from that. But how do you respond to those people that are really maybe negative, especially around being a female athlete and being disabled? Other than wanting to cry sometimes when you're having those strong days, do you ever what's kind of your response to people like that?
I think sometimes you would gently try and kind of like, I guess, give a bit of context or perspective, and kind of hopefully like just start to raise a little bit of awareness and kind of educate a little bit in a very like gentle, friendly way where, the person doesn't feel like, oh, defensive because, oh, I've said the wrong thing and I'm being told off. You kind of want to do it in a way that actually they still come away from the experience and it's positive, and they're like, okay, well, I learned something, but it was no big deal, and we just kind of move on, carry on, have a laugh, fence, whatever it is. So I think that's the ideal. At the same time, there are other days where you kind of feel like, do you know what? In some ways, it's not really as somebody that has kind of essentially been through quite a lot, in terms of losing my leg and everything like that. At times, you're like, do you know what? It's not my job to make sure that you say the right thing, because that should be your own self-education piece to kind of have a bit more awareness. But yeah, for the most part, I think I just try and kind of gently kind of, if somebody uses the wrong terminology, I just very, very gently kind of like just try and say, like, well, actually, for example, like wheelchair bound. Wheelchair bound is not really a term we use anymore. It's not really what you would want to hear somebody using, and sometimes it's just actually you just carry on the conversation and you just subtly actually use the correct terminology, so like wheelchair user, or like I use a wheelchair, or whatever it is, and you just kind of almost correct without actually mentioning you're correcting, and you just hopefully they cotton on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we've spoken quite a lot about you as an athlete and navigating the world of being a female athlete and a disabled athlete, but we can't forget the fact that you also have a career. And correct me if I'm your assistant sport producer at the BBC?
Yep.
Yes, amazing. That in itself, sometimes that's most people's lifelong dreams, going through education and getting those good jobs. So, how do you manage being such a successful Paralympic fencer and having such a great career?
With difficulty. I think the first thing to kind of managing it is actually just almost setting myself realistic expectations for what I can realistically as one human being achieve. And for right now, what that looks like is me going, okay, well, the goal is to win a Paralympic gold. The goal is to become world number one, win the world championships, all of these things. That's the main goal. So I kind of see fencing as essentially like my main job, and then
Okay.
almost work for the BBC as like a hobby in a sense. Um, which kind of sounds a bit of a weird way to put it, but I kind of like almost go, okay, well, this is the priority right now. Fencing is the priority. Now, do I want to do really well at my job? Yes. Do I want to make sure that people respect me? Do I want to make sure that I'm putting myself in an amazing situation where I have a career, whenever I decide to stop, have a career that I can pick up and run with? Yes. But do I need to compare myself to the people around me that maybe started at the BBC at the same time as me? No, because we've got a very different experience. They're currently putting 100% into their BBC career, and as a result, maybe they've gone out to the World Cup to present, or whatever it is. And sometimes I will sit there and be like, "Ah, oh, we literally started the same week, and look what they're doing, and look what I'm doing." But then I realized, oh, it's because I've got all this other stuff on my plate that I'm prioritizing. So that's really it for me. It's just actually just trying to be realistic with myself and saying, okay, what am I trying to achieve in each thing right now? At the moment, the balance is fencing here, BBC career here. Eventually, when I retire, it'll obviously go like this, and then I'll throw
Yeah.
all of the energy that I'm currently putting into my fencing into my BBC career. But
Yeah.
trying to kid myself. I tried for a while to do both at 100%, and it was not sustainable.
I know, I can imagine, but I doubt any of the others have got World Cup medals or been to the Paralympics as an athlete. So you don't get many opportunities to do that. So how do you set realistic expectations then with work so that you can balance it in the right amount so that you are prioritizing your fencing?
So for me, I was full time up until Tokyo, and then since Tokyo, I've basically gone freelance. So now for me, it's really just I'm really really fortunate that I work for the Five by Breakfast team, and they treat me like an employee despite the fact I'm freelance. So I have the same shifts every week. I know I can rely on that income. I'm a fully kind of integrated member of the team. You wouldn't really know I was freelance, but I just work those kind of 2 days a week that's definitely what I'm working. So that works, and then I kind of work my training around it. So say maybe training very early before, immediately after, I do my work from home, which is actually from the Leon Paul Centre. So I've got a little office set up at the Leon Paul Centre, and I basically have my lesson, go straight into my shift, work all day, then go straight back up to the cell and start fencing. So that's kind of really how I manage it on a week to week basis. It's just essentially making sure that I'm already in the right place to do my training. So there's no like worry about, oh, am I going to get there? Quite often it's a job where you end up working unpaid overtime. And it's also sometimes me just saying, look, guys, I need to go stab people right now, but once I've finished, I'll come back and do that thing. So sometimes it's having that flexibility and being really honest with people and saying, look, that is going to get done by when it needs to get done by, which for my case is always the next morning because we're a morning breakfast program. But sometimes it's just saying, look, I'm going to put it down for a few hours because I need to go spar whilst everyone else is here, and then I'll kind of crack back on after. So sometimes that means working in the car on the way home. Like I'll literally be writing my scripts in my notes app and then sending them to myself ready to bung in the running orders. Sometimes you'll see me WhatsApping guests whilst I'm doing my hamstring activation during my warm up. Like it's not always the perfect juggle. Like in a perfect world, you'd completely separate the two and you'd never be thinking about one whilst doing the other. But it's not quite that perfect. But I try and separate them as much as I can and have like discrete times when I'm like, right, okay, the minute I get into my fencing chair, I'm not thinking about it until I get back out. And then in terms of obviously 2 days a week isn't very many. So then the other thing that I do is basically just making sure that because I'm freelance and I have the ability to, It's that I pick up extra work when it fits around kind of the training and year calendar. So straight after a competition, for example, when I come back from Indonesia next month, I am working 4 days on the trot, which is hard when you have jet lag, but also it's a great opportunity because I got
Yeah.
offered the work and I can make up some of the money I've just missed whilst I've been away. So it's not the perfect juggle. It does sometimes mean not quite enough sleep. But then the other thing I've been trying to do is just really making sure that I always sleep extra in the first half of the week, and especially at the weekends. I give myself as much recovery as possible there to kind of minimize the impact of then having slightly less sleep on those days that I'm working, and then basically make it back up at the weekend and at least start the week with like a fresh slate, no sleep debt.
Yeah, yeah. Some people would say that having a career and splitting your time between being an elite athlete and having a really great career would be quite distracting. But how would you feel about the idea of it being a good distraction, of it giving you time out so that when you're on task fencing, that you're more engaged in it because you've had the escape through your career or your hobby is how you referred it
Yeah.
before. Would you agree with that? Would you disagree with that?
No, I think it can be a really good thing. I think for some people, being a full-time athlete and doing nothing else is really, really positive for them, and they love it, and that's what works best for them. I think for other people, actually, it then becomes a bit too much, and keeping that perspective of the fact that you are just basically hitting somebody with a long stick, whatever happens, the world keeps turning. I think sometimes for some athletes, you lose that perspective because if you're so laser focused on this one thing, that's all you ever do, that's all you ever think about, that's all you ever invest in. Then when it goes wrong, I think for some athletes that can feel more kind of detrimental and a lot worse. So I think for some it can be a really, really good thing to have something else. But I think, to be honest, I'd encourage it for anyone to at least some extent. Like, you don't necessarily have to do 2 full work days. If you can find a way to fund your fencing and do less of that, then great. If you're able to do that, but I think having something and knowing that no matter what happens, if I were to get a career-ending injury tomorrow, or I decide to end my career earlier than I currently have planned in my head for any reason, I already know exactly what I'm doing. I'm already set up to do it. I'm already employed doing it to some extent, and I can just pick it up and just throw everything into it. I think that's really, really useful to have. And I think sometimes the transition from being an athlete to kind of retiring and doing something else is so challenging if you haven't, particularly if you haven't actually had that kind of secondary career already kind of started. So I think I'd always encourage people
Yeah.
to do that, whether it's studying, whether it's working, whatever it is. Do something to set yourself up for life after, because as much as we would like to fence forever at international level, it's not possible to do so. Eventually, my body will give up, and or maybe my mind will give up. Who knows? But yeah, eventually, you will stop, and you need to kind of know what you're going to do to earn a living, and also just to keep yourself sane when you finish.
Yeah, it goes back to the athlete identity, I guess, doesn't it? That you are an athlete, but you're also a person that will be there for much longer than the sport will be. So it kind of highlights the importance of that. I like it, yeah. So just before we wrap up, we know that you do your dual career. You're a great athlete, but you also do athlete representation and you're an athlete leader. You play athlete leadership roles. How would you say that being involved as an athlete leader helps improve the overall health of fencing?
Yeah, I think athlete representation is absolutely like vital to sport. I think if you're not careful, if you don't have that input, sometimes things can kind of like snowball so much beyond actually the athletes that should be at kind of the heart of what you're doing. And sometimes decisions get made, and you just think, did anybody at any point actually think of how that impacted the athletes? And that might be something as simple as like the scheduling. Back in the, I think, Tokyo cycle, we had a competition that literally started at 9 a.m. in the morning and then finished at like 11 p.m. at night. And then we all had to get up and compete again at 9 a.m. the next morning. And it's like, because obviously in wheelchair fencing, you're pretty much all doing at least 2, maybe 3 weapons. And it's things like that where okay, I get that the president was coming and we wanted to show him a nice finals, but at no point did anyone consider the fact that if you don't hold your finals until 10 p.m. at night, nobody's getting any sleep, and the dinner's already finished, and there is no other alternative way of getting dinner at this particular hotel, and so everybody's going to bed hungry. And if you don't have that
Oh
athlete
no.
representation to just say this isn't working for the athletes, then sometimes that can get missed amongst kind of the wish to maybe broaden the sport or get more publicity or get a VIP in or whatever it is. So I think it's really, really important. And I think as well, it's really important for me. The most important thing when I'm doing the athlete representation work is there's only 6 of us on the International Athletes Council. I'm the chair currently, and for me, the most important thing is trying to get across to everybody and to remember myself that I'm not there to represent Great Britain. None of the people on the panel are there to represent their own countries. We're all there to represent the sport, and not just the sport now and how we think it should look now, but how it's going to look in 4, 8, 12, 20, 50 years' time, and whether we're still going to be part of the Paralympic movement. And that's one of the hardest things, is maintaining Paralympic status as a sport. It's incredibly hard, particularly for a sport like wheelchair fencing, which doesn't, it's not kind of one of the blue ribbon events. It might be one of the oldest, it might be one of the originals, but actually we are kind of one of the most at risk in terms of getting kicked out for not having maybe enough countries or enough continents represented. And also for not, frankly, representing at the moment enough impairment types, because there are other sports that have got kind of disciplines for visually impaired people, maybe kind of other things like that, intellectual impairments. We don't have any of that, so we're kind of always on the precipice of losing our status. So I think it's really, really important as an athlete representative that you're always keeping in mind that it's not just about what's good for your athlete group right now. And once you're trying to keep them happy, you're also trying to make sure that the sport still exists for the next cohort and the cohort after that.
Yeah. So a good question to finish on for today's session would probably be, what's your main focus as an athlete representative for the next Paralympic cycle?
Um, I think the main focus for the next Paralympic cycle is trying to achieve a kind of greater level of like proactivity. I think historically our panel has been a little bit more reactive in terms of maybe the international governing body come to us and say, we're thinking about doing this, what do you think? Or we're doing this, and then we go, whoa, that's a terrible idea. Here's why. I think what I'd really like is to be able to achieve kind of like a more proactive stance whereby we're saying, okay, well, this is how we think we can develop the sport. And that's really challenging. The most challenging thing with athlete representation is always getting a bunch of people together that then all want to do at least a decent amount of work. So a lot of the time you don't have that. A lot of the time 2 out of the 6 of you want to work hard and the other 4 are there in the spirit.
For the ride.
Yeah. So that can be really, really challenging part of our athlete representation. But yeah, I would like to get to the point where we're going forward. But I think we've achieved an awful lot in the last 12 months. We've now got a spot in executive committee meetings. So we've got a seat at the big table. We're having more input than ever in the biggest decisions, and also being taken more and more seriously. And I think that's really the aim for the next 4 years, is actually when we talk, we want them to listen and we want them to act. And of course, sometimes they won't agree, but actually, can we get to a point where our voice as an athlete group is taken so seriously that they really stop and think every time we say, okay, we think this, and they're like, oh, okay, actually, yeah, there's really sound reason behind that, and we know that you guys work hard, you do your homework, you think of all the possible ramifications and the pros and cons for something, and then you come to us with a really reasoned, like, logical suggestion. So I think that's probably the main aim, is just basically getting to a point where kind of the athlete voice is a seamless part in the process, rather than originally it was definitely seen as a like, oh, we should have that because people say we should have that. Now it's a, yeah, actually they do some good stuff, so we'll let them get involved. And what we really want it to be like, we're integral. So I think that's the aim of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I really hope that happens. I think that would be great. And I look forward to that happening, because I'm sure it will. But thank you very much, Gemma, for answering some of those questions. And I will hand back to Chris, who I don't know if there's any more questions from anybody else on the call.
So Yeah, Gemma, just to echo Grace's words. Thank you for that. I think your achievements and you describing how difficult it is to qualify for the Paralympic Games, and to think you've done that 4 times is really quite a remarkable achievement. And how you navigate the demands on your time with your professional career, your athlete representation work as well. I can only sort of take my hat off to you and be in awe of what you've achieved. So